Leave, and you leave with nothing. Those were the exact words my father said to me, his voice perfectly calm, completely devoid of any emotion, and colder than the Montana winter outside our window. I did not fully understand the terrifying, crushing weight of that threat when I first heard it. I honestly thought it just meant I would have to start from scratch, maybe struggle to pay rent for a few months, eat cheap ramen noodles, and work multiple exhausting shifts while I built my own independent life. I was completely, horribly wrong. My parents did not just want me to leave their house with an empty wallet. They wanted to guarantee I could not survive a single day in the real world without crawling back to them. Right now, I am 29 years old, and my current permanent residence is a crowded, noisy homeless shelter in the city of Billings. It is brutally cold here during the winter months, the kind of cold that seeps right through your boots and makes your bones ache. The shelter is always packed to the absolute limit with people trying to survive the freezing nights. I am sitting right there with them, possessing absolutely no money, no family safety net, and zero job prospects. It is definitely not for a lack of trying or laziness on my part. I spend hours every single day walking through the slush to the public library, sitting at their slow computers, and filling out job applications for literally anything I can find. I have applied to be a late-night gas station cashier, a floor cleaner, a diner dishwasher, and a warehouse stockworker. But my applications are constantly rejected, one after another, in a never-ending cycle of failure. I cannot even secure a minimum wage job because I have a massive, toxic red flag attached to my name. Wherever I go, no matter what city I move to, I am unofficially labeled as a financial criminal. No business owner or corporate manager wants to hire a person who supposedly has an active fraud investigation sitting on their background check. I honestly believe my life was going to end on a plastic cot in the shelter. I thought this was just my permanent reality now. Then, everything changed in an instant on a random, freezing winter morning. I was sitting alone at a cheap plastic table in the shelter's dining area, drinking a terrible cup of watery coffee, when a woman walked right through the heavy front doors. She wore a thick, expensive-looking winter coat and walked with a very clear, professional purpose. She did not look like an exhausted social worker or a weekend volunteer handing out soup. She scanned the room, locked her eyes directly on me, and walked straight over to my table. She looked me right in the eye and said something I will never, ever forget. "Your grandmother paid me 12 years ago to find you if things ever got this bad." After delivering that incredibly shocking sentence, she reached into her large leather bag and placed a heavy, locked metal box right on the table in front of my coffee cup. To understand why a complete stranger was handing me a metal box from my grandmother in a homeless shelter, you have to understand exactly where I came from and who my family is. My name is Elena Varga. I grew up in a place called Red Hollow, Montana. It is a very small, deeply isolated mining town tucked far away in the mountains. The population is incredibly small, sitting at only about 3,800 people. There is almost nothing to do there, and everyone knows everyone else's business. The entire town essentially consists of one old coal mine, one high school, one church, and exactly one local bar. In a town that's small and isolated, power is heavily concentrated in the hands of a few people. The Varga family, my family, was without a doubt the most powerful and influential family in the entire area. My grandmother, Agnes Kovacs, was a tough Hungarian immigrant who actually used to own an old silver mine in the region. She was a hard, intelligent woman who understood how the world really worked, but she passed away years ago. My father is Victor Varga. For 18 long years, he was the chief of police in Red Hollow. When you're the sheriff in a tiny town for nearly 2 decades, you are essentially the unquestioned king of the area. You know everyone's dirty secrets, you control how the law is applied, and everyone in town owes you a favor or fears crossing you. My mother is Marian Varga. While my father handled the law and the intimidation, she played the role of the perfect, caring wife by running a highly visible local charity organization. She organized food drives, collected coats for poor families, and always smiled warmly at everyone during Sunday church services. Because of my father's absolute authority and my mother's highly publicized charity work, my family was viewed as the ultimate moral model of the community. Everyone on the outside genuinely thought we were the perfect, ideal family. The horrifying truth is that the inside of my home was a high-security prison. My parents did not just raise me, They controlled every single detail of my life with extreme, suffocating precision. I was not even allowed to have a simple house key to my own childhood home until I turned 22 years old. If I went out anywhere, I had to report exactly where I was going, exactly who I was going to be with, and the exact minute I would be walking back through the front door. The financial control they held over me was somehow even worse than the physical rules. Whenever I worked a part-time job as a teenager or a young adult, I never actually saw my own hard-earned money. Every single dollar I earned went directly into a joint bank account that was entirely controlled by my mother. I had to literally beg her for a few dollars just to buy basic necessities or a cheap cup of coffee with a friend. They deliberately and systematically kept me financially helpless so I could never afford to buy a car, rent an apartment, or escape their grasp. This suffocating, miserable control went on for years until I finally reached my absolute breaking point at age 26. One day, I was sitting in my bedroom, looking around at the walls that felt like a cage, and a very clear, sharp thought hit my brain. If I stay here, I will die here. I knew with absolute certainty that I had to get out immediately. I secretly started looking for job opportunities far away from Red Hollow. I eventually submitted an application to a large mining equipment store located in the city of Helena. Because I grew up surrounded by the industry in a mining town, I actually knew a lot about the heavy equipment and the terminology. To my massive surprise, the store actually called me in for an in-person interview. I borrowed a car, drove all the way to Helena, and walked into that office feeling terrified but incredibly hopeful. The interview went incredibly well. The hiring manager really liked me, praised my deep knowledge of the inventory, and essentially told me the job was mine. I drove back home to Red Hollow that afternoon feeling like a massive weight had been lifted off my chest. I felt like I had finally won my freedom. That beautiful feeling of freedom lasted exactly 24 hours. The very next day, the manager from the Helena store called my phone again. His tone was completely different this time. He did not sound friendly or welcoming at all. He sounded cold, distant, and extremely cautious. He cleared his throat and said, "We received a warning from the sheriff's office about a fraud investigation involving you." I stood there completely stunned, unable to process what I was hearing. I had never committed fraud in my entire life. I did not even have access to my own money, so how could I possibly steal anyone else's? Then the sickening, horrifying reality set in. My father used his deep connections as a former police chief to completely destroy my job offer. He somehow found out I was trying to leave town, and instead of stopping me physically, he used his police influence to maliciously ruin my background check. After the Helena store manager hung up the phone, I sat on the edge of my bed for hours, completely paralyzed by what had just happened. I tried to convince myself it was a massive mistake, a random mix-up with someone else's background check. But deep down, I knew the terrifying truth. Over the next 8 months, my life turned into a daily psychological nightmare as I desperately tried to find a way out. I secretly applied to 9 different places across the state, ranging from retail shops to administrative offices. I used the slow computers at the local library, borrowed friends' laptops when I could, and did absolutely everything in my power to keep my job hunt hidden from my parents. Every single time I applied somewhere, the exact same scenario played out like a broken record. I would submit my resume, get a call back, and be invited for an in-person interview. I would show up, answer their questions perfectly, and the employer would tell me they were excited to bring me on board. Then, within a day or two, a mysterious source would suddenly contact the hiring manager. Immediately after that contact, the employer would cancel the job offer without giving me any real, logical explanation. I was slowly losing my mind, feeling like I was trapped inside an invisible cage that I simply could not break out of. The absolute breaking point came when I applied for a simple barista position at a local coffee shop a few towns over. The owner, a very straightforward older man, actually took the time to pull me aside after abruptly canceling my start date. He looked me right in the eye, clearly uncomfortable but wanting to be honest, and told me the exact truth. He said, "Someone sent us a document claiming you stole money from your previous employer." I felt all the blood drain from my face. I realized right then that my parents were not just making casual phone calls to give me a bad reference. They were actively manufacturing fake legal documents to completely destroy my reputation. That night, the paranoia and intense anger finally pushed me to do something I had never dared to do before. While my parents were fast asleep down the hall, I crept out of my bedroom and walked silently to my mother's home office. My heart was pounding out of my chest as I slowly opened her heavy desk drawer, terrified the floorboards would creak and wake them up. I dug through her neat stacks of charity paperwork and tax forms until my hand brushed against something different. I pulled out a small, thick black notebook. I opened the black notebook, turned on a small pen flashlight, and started reading. What I saw on those pages made my stomach violently drop. It was a meticulous, highly detailed record of my entire life and every move I had made. Inside, there was a perfectly organized list of all 9 places where I had submitted a job application over the last 8 months. My mother, the supposed saint of Red Hollow, who ran local charities and smiled at everyone, had been secretly tracking my every single move. Next to the names of the businesses, she had written specific, chilling notes in her neat handwriting. The notes said things like, "Call Monday," "Send report," and warn them they were running a highly organized, systematic campaign to economically sabotage their own daughter, ensuring I could never earn a single paycheck of my own. I did not sleep a single second that night. The next morning, I walked straight into the kitchen where my parents were sitting and having their morning coffee. I did not yell, and I did not scream. I simply walked over to the kitchen table and slammed the black notebook right down in the center of it. My mother looked down at the open notebook, looked up at me, and immediately started crying. But her tears were not real. They were a deeply manipulative defense mechanism she always used when she was caught doing something terrible. My father did not flinch. He slowly put down his coffee mug, looked at me with absolutely dead, emotionless eyes, and spoke in his cold, authoritative police chief voice. He simply said, "You're not ready for the real world." He honestly believed that deliberately destroying my future and sabotaging my independence was a form of protection, a way to keep me permanently under his absolute control. I looked right back at him, my hands shaking with pure rage, and told him I was packing my bags and leaving the house right then and there. I told them I would rather sleep on the freezing street than spend another second in their house. That was the exact moment my father delivered the horrific threat that would ruin the next few years of my life. He leaned back in his chair, stared right through me, and coldly replied, "Leave, and you leave with nothing." I stormed out of the kitchen and ran up the stairs to my bedroom to grab a bag. I genuinely thought he just meant I would not get any financial help or support from them. But my father, the former sheriff of Red Hollow, was a man who meant exactly what he said. Within a matter of hours, they executed a complete, coordinated attack on my life. I opened my banking app on my phone to check my balance, hoping I had enough money to buy a cheap bus ticket out of state. My stomach dropped into my shoes. My entire bank account had been completely zeroed out. Every single dollar I had ever earned from my part-time jobs, which went directly into the joint account my mother controlled, was entirely gone. She had transferred every penny away the second I threatened to walk out the door. Pure panic started to set in. I ran to the filing cabinet in the hallway to grab my passport, my birth certificate, and my social security card. The folders were completely empty. My parents had already removed and hidden all of my vital identification documents, so I could not legally prove who I was to anyone. I pulled out my cell phone to call a friend for an emergency ride, but the call immediately failed. I checked the top corner of the screen and saw that I had 0 signal. My father had already contacted the network provider and completely cut off my phone plan. I was completely trapped, but I refused to surrender to them. I grabbed a small, worn-out backpack from my closet and shoved a few pairs of jeans, some heavy shirts, and a winter jacket inside. I checked the pockets of my jeans and counted exactly $17 in crumpled bills. My phone's screen lit up one last time, showing me I only had 6% battery left before the device turned into a useless piece of glass and metal. With exactly $17, a single backpack, and absolutely no working phone, I walked out the front door of my childhood home and stepped out into the freezing night. I had absolutely nothing to my name, but for the first time in 26 years, I was finally away from them. Stepping off that front porch was the most terrifying moment of my entire existence. The cold Montana wind hit my face immediately, stinging my cheeks and making my eyes water. I started walking down the dark, quiet streets of Red Hollow, passing the small houses of neighbors who had known me my entire life. None of them knew the truth about the Varga family. None of them knew that the respected former sheriff and his charitable wife had just financially executed their own daughter and thrown her out into the freezing dark. I walked past the old coal mine, past the single high school, and past the quiet local church, knowing I could never turn back. I walked for miles that night, heading toward the main highway with my thumb out, hoping a passing truck would take me as far away from Red Hollow as possible. I kept my hand wrapped tightly around the $17 in my pocket, acutely aware that this incredibly small amount of money was the only thing standing between me and absolute starvation. I did not know where I was going to sleep. I did not know what I was going to eat the next day. I did not know how I was ever going to get a job without an ID, a working phone, or a clean background check. But as I watched the town limits of Red Hollow disappear behind me in the dark, I made a silent promise to myself. I was going to survive this nightmare, no matter what it took, and I was never going to let Victor and Marian Varga control my life ever again. The next 2 years of my life were an absolute living hell. After walking out of my childhood home with nothing but a small backpack and $17, I had to quickly learn how to survive on the brutal streets. I spent 2 grueling years moving from one overcrowded homeless shelter to another, just desperately trying to find a warm place to sleep during the freezing Montana winters. It was a humiliating, exhausting existence, but I absolutely refused to give up and go back to the toxic prison my parents had built for me. I spent every single day during those 2 years aggressively applying for jobs. I went to public libraries to use their slow computers, filled out hundreds of online applications, and walked into local businesses asking for paper forms. I was willing to do absolutely any kind of honest work just to get back on my feet. However, my parents were actively monitoring my life and severely upgraded their malicious sabotage tactics to ensure I remained completely destitute. The simple phone calls warning employers about a fake fraud investigation were no longer enough for them. They started fabricating highly official-looking documents to completely destroy my chances at getting hired. My father, using his vast knowledge from his 18 years as the town police chief, began sending fake emails directly from addresses designed to look exactly like official police department accounts. These fraudulent emails were sent straight to the human resources departments of the companies I applied to, making me look like a dangerous criminal. The level of their cruelty was genuinely hard to comprehend. They actually went as far as creating completely fake criminal records with my name and date of birth printed right on them. Whenever I actually managed to secure an interview or get a tentative job offer, these fraudulent background checks would miraculously appear on the hiring manager's desk. In the rare cases where they could not use their fake police identities, my parents would resort to sending vicious anonymous letters to the business owners. These letters were packed with horrific lies about my character, claiming I was a thief and an absolute liability to any business. The continuous, systematic rejection completely shattered my confidence, leaving me stuck in the shelter system with absolutely no way out. Then, my parents decided to cross a line that I honestly did not think was even possible. They realized I was surviving, barely, by using the resources at the homeless shelter, so they launched a direct, calculated attack on the shelter itself. One freezing afternoon, the director of the shelter pulled me aside and asked me to step into his cramped, messy office. He looked incredibly stressed and deeply concerned as he closed the door behind us. He looked me right in the eyes and told me they had just received a highly disturbing phone call on the shelter's main administrative line. The director explained that a woman pretending to be an official state social worker had called to issue a severe warning about me. This fake social worker explicitly told the shelter staff that I had a deeply documented history of violence and posed a severe, immediate physical danger to the other vulnerable residents living in the building. Because the shelter was responsible for the safety of dozens of people, the director had to take this fraudulent warning extremely seriously. He told me, with genuine regret in his voice, that the board of directors was actively considering kicking me out of the shelter immediately. They were literally going to throw me out into the freezing snow because of my parents' calculated lies. I broke down completely in that office. I had to literally beg the director to let me stay, crying and promising him that I had never been violent a single day in my life. I offered to let them search my bags, to isolate me in a corner away from everyone else, anything to avoid freezing to death on the streets. It took hours of desperate pleading, but but he finally agreed to let me keep my cot on a strict, temporary probationary basis. That was the darkest day of my entire life. I realized right then that my parents did not just want to control me, they were perfectly fine with watching me die on the streets as long as they won the battle. A few agonizing weeks after that horrific incident at the shelter, the incredibly unexpected meeting finally happened. This brings me exactly back to that freezing morning I mentioned at the very beginning of my story, sitting alone at the cheap plastic table in the shelter's dining area. I was drinking my terrible coffee when a woman in a heavy, expensive winter coat walked through the front doors with absolute purpose. This woman's name was Rachel Boone, and she was certainly not a state social worker or a charity volunteer. Rachel Boone was a highly skilled, professional private investigator. Rachel walked straight over to my table, looked at me with a serious expression, and sat down right across from me. She reached into her large leather bag and pulled out the heavy, worn metal box I described earlier. As she placed the old metal box down onto the plastic table, I just stared at it, completely speechless and deeply confused. Then, my eyes focused on the top of the heavy lid. There was a very specific, deeply personal inscription etched directly into the metal of the box. The words scratched into the metal read exactly, "For Elena, if my son ever goes too far." Right below those chilling words was a signature that made my heart completely stop in my chest. It was signed by Agnes Kovacs, my grandmother. My grandmother was a deeply resilient, tough Hungarian immigrant who fully understood the harsh realities of the world. She was the kind of woman who never took nonsense from anyone, and she had actually owned and operated an old silver mine in the region years ago. She was incredibly sharp, fiercely independent, and apparently she saw the terrifying truth about my father long before I ever did. She had been dead for years, but somehow she was reaching out from the grave to save my life. Rachel leaned forward, folded her hands on the table, and explained exactly why she was sitting in a homeless shelter in Billings. She told me that 12 years ago, when I was just a teenager trapped in my parents' house, my grandmother had quietly hired her. Agnes Kovacs had paid Rachel a substantial amount of money up front with one extremely specific, long-term instruction. She told the private investigator to keep a distant watch on me and to step in if my father, Victor Varga, ever completely destroyed my life. My grandmother knew her son was a controlling, dangerous man, and she knew he would eventually try to crush my independence. This metal box was the exact contingency plan she had built for me, waiting 12 long years to finally be delivered. Rachel Boone, the private investigator, sat across from me in that crowded homeless shelter and urged me to open the heavy metal box. My grandmother, Agnes Kovacs, had anticipated exactly what my father, Victor Varga, was capable of doing to me long before I ever realized the truth. She knew he would try to completely control his daughter, so she had hired Rachel 12 years ago to keep a close watch on my situation. When I finally turned the small key and opened the heavy lid of the box, my hands were shaking violently. The box contained 3 distinct layers of items that completely changed the trajectory of my life and gave me the exact weapons I needed to fight back. First, there was a massive, highly organized stack of physical evidence documenting my parents' deliberate crimes against me. Rachel had not just been passively watching from a distance, she had been meticulously gathering airtight proof of their relentless sabotage. Inside a thick manila folder, I found audio transcripts and USB drives containing exactly 62 recorded phone calls made by my mother. These were the exact calls Marian Varga made to various employers, spinning vicious, calculated lies to get my job offers immediately canceled. There were also printed copies of 14 completely fake emails that my father had sent from his computer. He had used his deep knowledge as the former sheriff to draft these emails, making them look exactly like official police correspondence warning human resources departments about my supposedly criminal background. Even worse, the folder contained 7 fraudulent police reports that my parents had completely fabricated from scratch to frame me as a dangerous financial criminal. Every single time I was rejected from a job over the last 2 years, Rachel had tracked down the exact document or phone call my parents used to illegally sabotage me. The second layer of the metal box contained the incredibly detailed records of Rachel's 12-year investigation into my family. My grandmother had paid her a massive upfront fee to periodically check in on my well-being and to build a comprehensive profile on my parents' highly manipulative tactics. Agnes Kovacs had correctly predicted that her son would eventually cross a major line and try to completely destroy my independence if I ever tried to leave Red Hollow. She made absolute sure that I would have an airtight, indisputable legal case against them when the time finally came to fight back. But it was the very bottom layer of the metal box that truly made me break down in tears right there at the plastic table in the shelter. I found a set of official, notarized financial documents and a deeply personal letter written in my grandmother's distinct, sharp handwriting. The letter explained that before she passed away, she had quietly sold the old silver mine she owned in the region. She took the massive profits from that sale and set up a highly secure, secret trust fund strictly in my name. The initial amount she deposited into the trust for me was exactly $420,000. Because the money had been sitting in carefully managed investments for over a decade while I was trapped in my parents' house, the total balance had grown to a staggering $610,000. My parents knew absolutely nothing about this hidden money, and they had absolutely zero legal access to it. In a single, unbelievable moment, I went from having exactly $17 and begging to stay on a shelter cot to having the massive financial power needed to completely destroy the invisible cage my parents built. I looked up at Rachel, completely stunned, holding the bank statements in my shaking hands, and asked her what I was supposed to do next. She did not hesitate for a single second. She told me she had already set up an immediate appointment for me with a highly respected attorney who was ready to review the evidence. With the resources from the secret trust fund finally available to me, I immediately walked out of that homeless shelter forever. I checked into a safe, clean hotel room, took a long, hot shower, and bought myself a decent, professional set of clothes for the first time in 2 grueling years. The very next morning, Rachel and I walked into the downtown office of a lawyer named Daniel Mercer. Daniel Mercer was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who specialized in complex civil litigation and going after abusive figures of authority. I sat in his plush, leather chair and spent 3 uninterrupted hours explaining absolutely everything about my life. I told him about the extreme control in Red Hollow, the black notebook my mother kept to track my job applications, the zeroed-out bank accounts, and the 2 years of relentless, malicious job sabotage. Then, Rachel placed the massive stack of hard evidence from the metal box directly onto his wide mahogany desk. Daniel Mercer put on his reading glasses and spent a long time quietly reading through the 7 fake police reports, the 14 fraudulent emails, and the transcripts of the 62 recorded phone calls. The room was completely silent as he processed the sheer volume of their cruelty. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mix of absolute disgust at my parents and sheer professional excitement. He looked me right in the eye, tapped the stack of fake police reports, and said, "This is one of the clearest defamation cases I've ever seen." He explained that my parents were incredibly arrogant and had left a massive, undeniable paper trail of their malicious actions. We were not just going to send them a quiet cease and desist letter, we were going to take them to civil court and expose their true nature to the entire world. Daniel Mercer officially took my case right then and there, and we immediately began drafting a massive, multi-count lawsuit against Victor and Elena Varga. We decided to officially sue them for severe defamation, intentional harassment, and calculated economic sabotage. The lawsuit detailed every single job opportunity one had lost, every single fake legal document they had illegally generated, and the extreme, calculated emotional distress they had purposefully inflicted upon me over the years. I knew that serving this massive lawsuit would send absolute shockwaves through the tiny, quiet town of Red Hollow. For 18 years, my father had walked those isolated streets as the unquestioned, untouchable chief of police. My mother had spent decades meticulously building her flawless reputation as a charitable, deeply moral pillar of the community. They genuinely believed they were completely invincible because nobody in a town of exactly 3,800 people ever dared to question the powerful Varga family. But they had never faced an opponent who actually had the hard evidence and the massive financial resources to fight them on equal footing. Thanks to my grandmother's incredible foresight, the relentless 12-year investigation by Rachel, and the $610,000 sitting safely in my name, I was finally ready to drag their dark, abusive secrets out into the glaring light. My parents had used their wealth and influence to destroy every job I ever applied for, trying to starve me into submission. Now, I was going to use my grandmother's secret file to systematically tear down the perfect, fake lives they had built for themselves. The agonizing days of hiding in freezing homeless shelters, begging for minimum wage diner jobs, and fearing the corrupt reach of the former sheriff were officially over. It was finally time for Victor and Elena Varga to face the devastating consequences of their own actions. Filing the massive lawsuit against my own parents was simultaneously the most terrifying and the most empowering action I have ever taken in my entire life. My attorney, Daniel Mercer, wasted absolutely no time putting our plan into motion. We officially filed a multi-count civil lawsuit against Victor and Elena Varga, suing them specifically for severe defamation, intentional harassment, and calculated economic sabotage. We did not just quietly mail the documents to them. Daniel hired a professional, highly aggressive process server to drive all the way up to the isolated mountains of Red Hollow. He specifically instructed the server to deliver the massive stack of legal papers to my parents on a Sunday morning, right as they were walking out of their local church. I was not there to see it, but the process server later told us that my mother's perfect, charitable smile instantly vanished, and my father's face turned bright red with pure anger. For 18 years, my father had been the unquestioned chief of police in that tiny town of exactly 3,800 people. He was entirely used to intimidating people into total submission, making problems disappear with a single phone call, and acting like he was completely above the law. At first, my parents genuinely thought the lawsuit was a pathetic bluff. My father actually tried to call Daniel Mercer's law office directly, using his heavy, authoritative police voice to demand that we drop the case immediately. He threatened to have me arrested for filing a frivolous lawsuit. Daniel Mercer simply put my father on speakerphone, laughed out loud, and told him that he would see him in federal court. That was the exact moment Victor Varga realized he was no longer dealing with a terrified, helpless 26-year-old girl who only had $17 in her pocket. He was dealing with a ruthless, highly experienced civil litigation attorney backed by a $610,000 trust fund that my grandmother, Agnes Kovacs, had secretly set up for me. The next few months were consumed by the grueling legal process known as discovery. This is the phase where both sides have to legally hand over their evidence. Daniel Mercer was completely merciless during this phase. He immediately drafted a highly specific subpoena demanding that my mother surrender the thick black notebook she used to track my job applications. My mother, who spent her entire life carefully curating her public image as the saint who ran the local charity, panicked completely. Her lawyer initially tried to claim that no such notebook existed. However, Rachel Boone, the private investigator my grandmother hired 12 years ago, had already taken dozens of high-resolution photographs of the notebook's pages during her investigation. When Daniel Mercer presented these photographs to the judge angrily ordered my mother to produce the physical notebook immediately or face severe criminal charges for destroying evidence. They were legally forced to hand over the black notebook and every single cruel note my mother wrote, like "Call Monday," "Send report," and "Warn them," was officially entered into the permanent court record. Next, Daniel Mercer completely dismantled my father's arrogant, fake police operation. My father genuinely believed he was a technical genius when he created those 14 fake emails. He had set up email addresses designed to look exactly like official law enforcement accounts to warn human resources departments about a fake fraud investigation involving me. He thought he had covered his tracks perfectly. But Daniel Mercer hired a top-tier forensic cyber expert to analyze the digital footprint of every single message. The cyber expert easily tracked the IP addresses of all 14 fake emails. The IP addresses did not trace back to any police station. They traced directly back to the wireless internet router sitting right in the middle of my parents' living room in Red Hollow. We now had indisputable, scientifically proven evidence that the former chief of police was personally manufacturing fake police reports to economically sabotage his own daughter. Armed with the black notebook and the tracked IP addresses, we started contacting the employers who had rejected me over the past 2 years. Daniel Mercer and I drove across the state to personally meet with the hiring managers, the warehouse supervisors, and the local business owners. We sat down with the older man who owned the local coffee shop, the one who had honestly told me that someone sent a document claiming I stole money from my previous employer. We showed him the physical proof that the document was completely forged by my parents. We also drove back to Helena and met with the manager of the mining equipment store, the very first person who canceled my job offer after receiving a fake warning from the sheriff's office. When these business owners saw the hard evidence, their reactions shifted from confusion to absolute outrage. They realized they had been deliberately manipulated and lied to by a former police chief who was using official government authority to run a personal vendetta. Many of these employers were so furious about being used as pawns in my parents' twisted game of control that they immediately agreed to testify in court on my behalf. We rapidly built a massive list of highly credible witnesses who were ready to stand in front of a judge and explain exactly how Victor and Elena Varga had systematically destroyed my employment opportunities. As the court date approached, the details of the massive lawsuit officially became public record. In a deeply isolated place like Red Hollow, where there is only one high school, one bar, and a single church, news travels incredibly fast. For decades, my family was viewed as the ultimate moral model of the community. But suddenly, reporters from larger cities started requesting the court documents. People in town started talking in the grocery store aisles and at the local diner. The perfect, flawless image that my parents had spent their entire lives building began to rapidly crack and fall apart. The town of Red Hollow finally started to realize the terrifying truth about the Varga family. They realized that the respected former sheriff and the smiling charity director had secretly spent years psychologically and economically torturing their only child, going as far as tracking her down at a homeless shelter to ruin her life. My parents were completely backed into a corner, completely stripped of their local power and their fake public image. The absolute worst fear of a controlling abuser is being publicly exposed, and that is exactly what was happening to them. We finally arrived at the morning of the trial. I walked into the large, heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse wearing a sharp, tailored suit paid for by my grandmother's trust fund. I sat down at the plaintiff's table next to Daniel Mercer and Rachel Boone. A few minutes later, the heavy doors opened again, and my parents walked into the courtroom. They did not look powerful, arrogant, or untouchable anymore. My father looked physically exhausted and deeply aged, and my mother looked completely terrified as she realized that her fake tears would not work in a federal courtroom. I looked right at them, entirely unafraid, knowing that after 2 years of sleeping on freezing shelter cots and begging for minimum wage jobs, I was finally going to hold them legally accountable for every single thing they did to me. The federal courtroom was massive, quiet, and incredibly intimidating, but for the very first time in my entire life, I felt completely safe and in control. We were finally at the trial stage of my civil lawsuit against my own parents, Victor and Elena Varga. The trial was certainly not a secret. The large wooden benches in the gallery behind us were completely packed with people who had driven all the way from our tiny, isolated mining town of Red Hollow just to watch the spectacle. Red Hollow only has about 3,800 residents, and my family had always been the most powerful and respected household in the entire area. The people in the gallery included our former neighbors, the pastor from the town's single church, and people who had always praised my parents as the ultimate moral models of the community. They all wanted to see the respected former police chief and his charitable wife face a federal judge. My attorney, Daniel Mercer, stood up to deliver his opening statement, and he did not hold anything back at all. He laid out the entire timeline, explaining exactly how my parents had systematically isolated me, financially abused me, and deliberately sabotaged my attempts to build an independent life. He told the judge about the night I left with exactly $17, a single backpack, and a phone with only 6% battery. He explained how they drained my bank accounts and forced me into the homeless shelter system. Then, Daniel started calling our witnesses to the stand. The first group of witnesses were the various employers who had rejected me over the past 2 years. The manager from the mining equipment store in the city of Helena took the stand first. He looked directly at the judge and testified that I was an excellent candidate during my initial interview and that he fully intended to hire me. He then stated under oath that the only reason he abruptly canceled my job offer 24 hours later was because he received a highly concerning phone call. He testified that the caller explicitly claimed to be from the sheriff's office and officially warned him about an active fraud investigation involving me. Next, the older man who owned the local coffee shop took the stand. He was a man who had honestly pulled me aside a year ago to tell me the brutal truth about why I was not hired. He testified that someone had sent his business a highly official-looking document. He told the court that this fraudulent document explicitly claimed I had stolen money from my previous employer. Listening to these employers testify was incredibly validating. They confirmed everything I had experienced, proving to the entire courtroom that I was never crazy and that the relentless, malicious sabotage was completely real. After the employers finished testifying, Daniel Mercer moved on to the hard physical evidence we had gathered from the metal box my grandmother, Agnes Kovacs, had left for me. This was the exact moment the trial truly shifted from a civil dispute into a devastating public exposure of my parents' calculated crimes. Daniel called a forensic cyber expert to the witness stand to discuss the fake emails my father had sent. My father, Victor, had spent 18 long years as the town's chief of police. He used that deep law enforcement knowledge to craft highly realistic emails designed to look exactly like official police correspondence. These 14 fake emails were sent directly to the human resources departments of the companies I applied to, warning them about my fabricated criminal background. When Daniel called my father to the stand, the tension in the room was incredibly thick. Victor sat up extremely straight and tried to use his authoritative police chief voice, the exact same voice he used to intimidate the residents of Red Hollow for nearly 2 decades. He initially completely denied knowing anything about the 14 fake emails, aggressively claiming his home computer must have been hacked by an unknown person. But Daniel Mercer did not care about his old badge or his tough attitude. Daniel referred back to the cyber expert's testimony. The expert had easily tracked the digital footprint of those specific emails. He traced the IP addresses of all 14 fake emails directly back to the wireless internet router located inside my parents' living room. Daniel asked my father if a random hacker would specifically target his daughter's obscure job applications at a local diner and a warehouse just to ruin her life. My father's face turned completely red, and he started to stammer nervously. He had absolutely no logical answer. The former sheriff, who used to dictate the law, was caught dead to rights committing severe defamation. The final piece of major evidence presented was the most personal and the most damaging. Daniel Mercer called my mother, Mary Ann, to the witness stand. My mother had spent her entire life carefully building a flawless public image as a saint who ran the local charity in Red Hollow. She always smiled warmly at church events and collected winter coats for poor families. As she sat in the witness box, she wore a modest dress and tried to act like a gentle, concerned parent. But Daniel Mercer completely shattered that fake image when he placed her own thick black notebook right in front of her. This was the exact notebook I had discovered hidden in her home office desk drawer. Daniel opened the notebook and used a projector to display its pages onto the large screen in the courtroom so everyone in the gallery could see it. The pages showed a meticulous, highly organized list of every single place where I had submitted a job application. Next to the names of the businesses, my mother had written specific, chilling instructions in her own neat handwriting. Daniel forced her to read her own notes out loud to the court. Her voice shook as she read the words, "Call Monday, send report," and warned them directly into the microphone. Daniel also brought up the 62 recorded phone calls gathered by Rachel Boone, my grandmother's private investigator. He played one of the audio recordings out loud. It was my mother's voice, crystal clear, telling a hiring manager vicious lies to get my job offer canceled. My mother tried to cry right there on the stand, hoping her fake tears would manipulate the judge the way they had always manipulated the people of Red Hollow. But the federal judge was completely unmoved by her emotional display. As the trial progressed over the week, the entire town of Red Hollow finally began to realize the terrifying truth. I turned around and looked at the people sitting in the gallery. The neighbors and the pastor looked completely disgusted and horrified. The flawless facade was completely shattered. They realized that the respected moral models of their community had secretly spent years psychologically and economically torturing their only child. They saw the undeniable proof that my parents had tracked me down at a homeless shelter, fabricated my criminal record, and tried to starve me into submission just to maintain their absolute control. When Daniel Mercer finally rested our case, the silence in the courtroom was incredibly heavy. We had presented an overwhelming mountain of irrefutable evidence. We had the 62 recorded phone calls, the 14 IP-tracked emails, the the 7 fake police reports, the black notebook, and the direct testimony of multiple independent business owners. My parents' defense attorney barely had anything to say during his closing arguments because there was absolutely no way to argue against the hard facts. They could not claim it was a simple misunderstanding, and they could not claim they were just trying to protect me. It was purely intentional, calculated abuse from start to finish. I sat at the plaintiff's table, looking at my parents across the room. They looked completely broken, defeated, and entirely stripped of the fake authority they had wielded for my entire life. The trial portion was finally over, and now we just had to wait for the federal judge to deliver the final verdict. The agonizing wait for the federal judge to deliver his final verdict felt like it lasted an entire lifetime. I sat next to my attorney, Daniel Mercer, and the private investigator, Rachel Boone, just staring at the heavy wooden doors at the front of the courtroom. The gallery behind me was still completely packed with people who had traveled all the way from our tiny mountain town of Red Hollow. They were all whispering among themselves, still reeling from the overwhelming amount of hard evidence that had been presented over the last few days. They had finally seen the indisputable proof that my parents, the respected former police chief, and the smiling charity director, were actually calculated abusers. When the heavy doors finally swung open and the federal judge walked back up to his bench, the entire courtroom went completely, terrifyingly silent. The judge sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly across the room at my parents, Victor and Elena Varga. He did not mince his words, and he did not show them a single ounce of sympathy. He spoke with a clear, booming voice that echoed off the high ceiling of the courtroom, stating that in all his years on the federal bench, he had rarely seen a case of such deliberate, malicious, and sustained abuse perpetrated by parents against their own child. He systematically went through the specific charges we had filed, confirming that we had overwhelmingly proven our case for severe defamation, intentional harassment, and calculated economic sabotage. The judge specifically addressed my father first. He looked right at Victor, a man who had spent 18 years acting like he owned the entire town of Red Hollow, and completely tore him down. The judge stated that my father's use of his former law enforcement knowledge to fabricate official police documents was a massive abuse of public trust. He specifically cited the 14 fake emails tracked directly to my parents' living room router and the 7 completely fraudulent police reports designed to frame me as a dangerous criminal. The judge made it completely clear that my father was nothing more than a bully who used illegal intimidation tactics to completely destroy my chances of getting hired anywhere. Then, the judge turned his attention directly to my mother. He pointed to the thick black notebook sitting on the evidence table, the exact notebook my mother had used to meticulously track every single job application I submitted over the course of 8 months. He called her behavior highly disturbing and deeply predatory. He explicitly referenced the 62 recorded phone calls where she spun vicious lies to various human resources managers, getting my job offers canceled one after another. He told her that her fake public image as a charitable, moral pillar of the community was completely worthless in his courtroom, and that the physical evidence proved she was actively trying to ruin my life. After delivering his scathing reprimand, the judge finally handed down the actual legal consequences. He officially ruled in my favor on every single count and ordered my parents to pay me exactly $140,000 in direct financial compensation. This massive amount was calculated to cover the wages from the jobs I had lost, the extreme emotional distress they had intentionally caused me, and the agonizing 2 years I was forced to spend living in crowded homeless shelters. I heard a collective, loud gasp from the townspeople sitting in the gallery behind me when the judge announced that massive dollar amount. But the $140,000 was not even the best part of the judge's final ruling. The judge immediately issued a strict, permanent restraining order against both Victor and Elena Varga. He explicitly ordered them to never contact me again, to never attempt to track my location, and to never contact any of my current or future employers for the rest of their lives. He made it absolutely clear that if they violated this permanent restraining order by sending even one single fake email or making one anonymous phone call, they would be immediately arrested and sent to federal prison. The invisible cage that they had kept me trapped inside for 26 years was officially and legally shattered into a million pieces. I looked across the courtroom at my parents as the judge, slammed his gavel down to officially close the trial. The absolute humiliation and defeat on their faces was something I will never forget. My father, who always told me I would leave with nothing and never survive in the real world, looked completely crushed. His arrogant, authoritative posture was entirely gone. My mother was sobbing, but for the first time in her life, she was not crying fake tears to manipulate a situation. She was crying real tears of absolute panic because she knew her flawless reputation in Red Hollow was permanently destroyed. Every single person in that gallery, including her neighbors and her pastor, now knew she was a cruel, manipulative liar. The immediate financial consequences of the lawsuit hit my parents incredibly hard and extremely fast. They simply did not have $140,000 in liquid cash just sitting in a bank account ready to hand over to me. My father had been retired from the police force for years, and they had spent a massive amount of money hiring an expensive defense attorney to try and fight Daniel Mercer in federal court. Because the court order legally mandated that they pay me the full compensation amount immediately, they were completely backed into a massive financial corner. They only had one major asset left to their name that could cover the heavy cost of the lawsuit. Victor and Elena Varga were legally forced to put their massive, perfect house in Red Hollow up for sale. This was the exact same house where they had kept me as a prisoner, the house where I was not even allowed to have my own key until I was 22 years old. The poetic justice of the entire situation was absolutely overwhelming. When I was 26 years old, they had completely drained my bank accounts, cut off my phone plan, and forced me out into the freezing Montana winter to live on the streets. Now, because of my grandmother's brilliant secret file and the massive lawsuit, my parents were the ones being forced to pack up their belongings and leave their home. They had to endure the absolute humiliation of putting a for sale sign on their front lawn while the entire town of Red Hollow watched them pack their boxes and leave the community in total disgrace. After the judge dismissed the courtroom, I stood up from the plaintiff's table. I shook Daniel Mercer's hand, thanking him for being so aggressive and absolutely relentless during the trial. Then, I turned to Rachel Boone, the private investigator who had spent 12 years honoring my grandmother's dying wish. I hugged her tightly, knowing that none of this would have been possible without her bringing that metal box to the homeless shelter in Billings. I grabbed my coat, pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse, and walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight. For the first time in my entire 29 years of existence, I did not have to look over my shoulder. I did not have to hide my job applications, and I did not have to fear the town sheriff. I was finally completely free. Walking out of those heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse that afternoon was the absolute end of my nightmare and the true beginning of the rest of my life. For the very first time in almost 3 decades, I woke up the next morning without the crushing, suffocating weight of anxiety sitting heavily on my chest. I did not have to immediately rush out into the freezing cold to find a public library. I did not have to send out desperate job applications to diners and gas stations, and I did not have to worry about a shelter director threatening to throw me out into the snow because of a fake phone call. A few weeks after the trial officially concluded, the severe financial realities of the federal judge's orders firmly set in for my parents. Because they were legally mandated to pay me the massive sum of $140,000 in direct compensation for the deliberate economic sabotage and extreme emotional distress they caused, they had absolutely no choice but to liquidate their assets. Victor and Elena Varga were permanently forced to sell the massive, perfect house in Red Hollow, the exact same house where they had kept me as an absolute prisoner for so many years. The town of Red Hollow, a deeply isolated place of only 3,800 people, watched the disgraced former police chief and the exposed charity director pack their boxes and leave the community in complete humiliation. With the compensation check officially cleared and the remaining balance of the massive trust fund my grandmother, Agnes Kovacs, had set up safely secured in my own private bank accounts, I finally had the absolute power to choose exactly where I wanted to live. I packed my things, leaving behind the miserable city of Billings where I had spent 2 grueling years sleeping on a plastic cot in a homeless shelter. I bought myself a safe, reliable car and drove straight to the city of Bozeman, Montana. Moving to Bozeman was undoubtedly the best decision I have ever made in my entire life. It is a beautiful, vibrant, and welcoming city that felt like an entirely different universe compared to the suffocating, toxic, and highly controlled environment of Red Hollow. There were no whispering neighbors, no corrupt sheriffs, and absolutely no traces of the destructive Varga family influence anywhere to be found. The very first thing I did when I arrived in Bozeman was sign a long-term lease for a beautiful, sunlit apartment right near the center of town. When the landlord smiled and handed me the keys to the front door, I actually stood in the hallway and cried tears of pure, overwhelming happiness. It might sound like an incredibly small thing to most people, but you have to remember the strict, terrifying rules I lived under for my entire youth. My parents were so deeply controlling that I was not even allowed to have a simple key to my own childhood home until I was 22 years old. Holding those apartment keys meant I finally had a safe, secure space that belonged entirely to me. Nobody was going to lock me out in the cold if I missed an arbitrary curfew. Nobody was going to demand to know my exact location at all times, and nobody was ever going to tell me how to live my life again. However, I knew that simply having a large amount of money from my grandmother's old silver mine and the successful lawsuit was not enough to make me feel truly fulfilled. I wanted to build a meaningful career and make absolutely sure that nobody else ever had to endure the kind of malicious, systematic abuse I had barely survived. Because of everything my father put me through, I developed a deep, highly personal interest in the law and the justice system. I officially enrolled in the local university in Bozeman and began dedicating my time to studying criminal justice. I chose to major in criminal justice specifically because I had seen firsthand exactly how the legal system could be maliciously weaponized by corrupt people in power. My father had used his 18 years of experience as a town sheriff to completely fabricate police reports, draft fake official emails, and relentlessly destroy my life. I wanted to learn absolutely everything about the system, so I could use the law to actively protect vulnerable people, instead of using it to crush them into submission the way he did. While attending my university classes, I also wanted to gain practical, real-world experience in the legal field to prepare for my future. I confidently applied for a position working at a highly respected local law firm in Bozeman. This time, when I submitted my resume and went into the office for my interview, I did not feel that familiar, sickening dread deep in my stomach. I knew with absolute certainty that my parents were strictly bound by a permanent federal restraining order. I knew that if they ever tried to interfere with my employment again, they would be immediately arrested and sent straight to federal prison. The partners at the law firm were incredibly impressed by my drive and hired me almost immediately. When I received my very first paycheck from the firm, I took the physical piece of paper and just stared at it for a long time. For my entire teenage and young adult life, every single dollar I ever earned had been forced directly into a joint bank account that was entirely controlled by my mother. Now, I drove to my own bank, deposited my own hard-earned money into an account that only I had access to, and bought myself whatever I wanted without ever having to beg anyone for permission. The heavy metal box that Rachel Boone handed to me in the homeless shelter that freezing morning now sits proudly right on my desk in my Bozeman apartment. I keep it there as a daily, physical reminder of exactly where I came from and exactly who saved me. My grandmother, Agnes Kovacs, was an incredibly tough, perceptive Hungarian immigrant who saw the absolute worst traits in her own son and decided to protect me anyway. She knew my father would eventually go too far in his quest for total control, and she spent 12 years paying a private investigator to watch over me, making sure I had the exact weapons I needed to fight back when the time came. Every single time I look at the personal engraving scratched into the lid of that box, I feel a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude. She gave me the financial resources, the hard evidence, and the ultimate opportunity to completely shatter the invisible cage my parents built around me. Looking back at everything that happened, from the terrifying night I left my house with exactly $17 and a dying phone to the incredible moment the federal judge slammed his gavel down, I realize how much I have fundamentally changed. I am absolutely no longer the terrified 26-year-old girl who thought her life was completely over just because her father maliciously canceled a job offer at a mining equipment store in Helena. I survived the freezing homeless shelters, the constant, heartbreaking rejections, and the deliberate psychological torture. My parents genuinely believed they could completely destroy my independence and force me to come crawling back to them, but their extreme cruelty only made me tougher, smarter, and infinitely more determined to succeed. The most important lesson I learned from this entire horrific ordeal is incredibly simple, but it cost me years of my life and endless suffering to fully understand. Freedom isn't something they give you. Sometimes you have to take it back.